Hello, everybody. Welcome to your free GMAT prep hour. It is November 9th, 2020. My name is Reed Arnold. I will be your host through the wonderful world of the GMAT this evening. Welcome, everybody. Those of you that are here live, welcome for people from all over the world joining us here tonight. That's great. If you are watching on YouTube later on, welcome. Happy to help you as you study for the GMAT. If you are looking for other free study options, please keep in mind that you can try the first class of any of our 9 class sessions for free. That is 1/9, 11% of the GMAT course that you get. You don't have to pay a dime. Show up at your convenience, pick a time that fits, search the teachers, see if there's one that you think you'll jibe with, and show up. And class 1, we talk about some really big stuff. I always mention that. We talk about how the test works. We talk about data sufficiency and some big strategies in data sufficiency, and we talk about some big strategies in sentence correction. So if you want some free GMAT prep there, it's available to you. You don't have to sign up. You don't have to pay a dime. You can also try our Interact course. That is our online learning, like video course. Really neat program. It's award-winning software. It adapts to you. If you answer a question right, the video course will take you to a harder question. If you get it wrong, it will take you to an easier question to make sure those foundations really get built up solidly. So it's a really, really neat product. It's a lot more responsive than your typical video course will be. We also have private tutoring options, coaching session options, all sorts of things, books, material. We have a free GMAT Prep Hour channel. Check the other videos on this channel. We have a blog. Look for articles in our blog. Okay, a lot of resources out there for you to work on as you study for this test. Yeah, I think that's my introduction. So now, today and tonight we are talking about critical reasoning. This is one of my favorite things to discuss on the GMAT because I find that critical reasoning is the question type and the skill that most applies to real life. I often tell my students that the things the GMAT tests are not really the things the GMAT tests, right? The GMAT does not really care if you know the formula for area of a circle. It does not care if you know perfect grammatical structure and whatnot. It's using these things as stand-ins for other skills that business schools do care about. And I do believe that's true. Having said that, it's still frustrating that we have to memorize the rules of a circle, and it's still a little annoying that we have to know all these kind of grammar rules that we haven't thought about since we first learned grammar. And so it can be very frustrating to study for this test because it's just like, I'm never going to use this again. This is totally useless. But critical reasoning is different. Critical reasoning is something you have the chance to do day in, day out in your day-to-day lives. Okay. Particularly the kind of critical reasoning questions we're going to talk about tonight: argument questions, assumption family questions. You encounter arguments all the time. Okay, at work, people think we should do this because of these reasons. In politics, I don't know if you knew this, but we're in in the United States anyway, we're in like a pretty politically tumultuous time. A lot of arguments being made. You can develop the tools to dissect those arguments well, and use the skills you learn on the GMAT for those arguments. Okay, so we're going to talk today about arguments and assumptions, what they are, how to find them, and as I showed on that other slide, what I consider the 3 key questions for finding assumptions and for basically critical reasoning, what critical reasoning means. So we're going to be talking today about the assumption family. That is finding the assumption questions, strengthening and weakening arguments, and evaluating arguments. This is my own kind of thing, I actually argue that explain the discrepancy questions are also a form of the assumption family, and I am happy to go into that a little bit later and explain why I think so. Most of our material will not categorize them as such, but I think that there's a reason to think that they are. And on the GMAT, you're going to have 6 to 10 questions in this assumption family. Okay. I have a question: is this in order of frequency? No, it is not. I would say in order of frequency, you're going to have strength and weaken are the most common. Finding the assumption is probably the second most common. Inference and discrepancy probably tied for third. Evaluate fourth, I guess fifth technically, and argument structure sixth, if you wanted, and that's based on my gut instinct here, but I would say that is the order of frequency here. And you're going to see 10 or 11 CR questions in general, and 6 to 10 of them are going to fit in this assumption family. And why is it called the assumption family? Because it has to do with assumptions. Okay. I'm having a question here in the Q&A tab. If you can go ahead and, if you have a question, type it in the main chat. It's hard for me to keep too many of these things open. I think so the question here is, what about boldface? And boldface is what we put in the argument structure, right? That's where they bold part of the argument. And you have to say what that bold sentence is doing in the argument structure. You probably won't see one of those on the test. They're actually not that common. So of the 10 or 11 CR questions you're going to see, 6 to 10 are going to be in this assumption family, and it's called the assumption family because it deals with assumptions, it deals with arguments. Okay, and so we're going to talk about how to handle arguments, and again, the 3 key questions to deal with arguments. These are those questions. Okay, this is the key, in my opinion. I've taught this for like 7 years now, and it's taken me 7 years to distill the skills, the process of assumption family questions to these 3 things. What does it mean for this specific conclusion to be false? How could that happen? How could the conclusion be false, given that the premises are true? And so what assumptions must be true to save the argument from being false, from being ruined? Those are the 3 key questions. And we're going to talk about how being good at answering those questions helps you dissect arguments, cut into arguments, and will help you find right answers in assumption family questions. Okay. So let's start with kind of a warm-up question here. It's a silly example I've made up, but go ahead, read and answer. We only have 2 answer choices. That's okay. It's part of the game. Let's see what we think. If you have an answer, feel free to answer in the group chat, for sure. It's about 1.5 minutes. Go ahead and put in a final guess if you haven't guessed yet. Okay. So I'm getting, it looks like B has the gravity. There are a handful of A's as well. B has the gravity though. And let's talk about this. The key idea for critical reasoning is that we are interested in the reasoning of the argument, not the reality of the argument. We want to figure out how the author or how the arguer is thinking. Okay. And for that, we want to think about the 3 key questions, because this will help us find the assumptions in an argument. What would it mean for this conclusion to be false? And I should define conclusion. I don't want to assume everyone has the terminology already downloaded tonight. So the conclusion is the part of the argument the arguer really wants you to believe. It's the thing they want you to walk away totally agreeing with. Okay. So the conclusion in this particular argument is going to be probably that they are confident they are going to, Bill and Steve, these tech wizards who have suspiciously similar names to Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. They are confident that they were going to open their store in 6 months. So that is their conclusion. That's what they believe. Okay. So what would it mean for that conclusion to be false? What would it mean for this particular conclusion to be wrong? It would mean that they do not open their company within 6 months. Okay. Well, why do they think they're going to open their company? Okay. This would be the premise and conclusion. And we're not going to talk a lot tonight about dissecting arguments and identifying premise and conclusion, but it is one of the major skills in critical reasoning. We would say open their doors in 6 months. Why are they going to do that? Well, the premises, they've saved some money and they're going to have a bake sale to raise what they need, to raise the rest. This is not meant to be realistic. It's meant to sound kind of silly because we're just interested in the reasoning going on here. So what would it mean for this conclusion to be false? It would mean that this is wrong. And it always helps to be insanely specific on the conclusion. The more specific you are on the conclusion, the more sharply you can critique the reasoning. And it's important to note that all we care about is this conclusion. We don't care if there's, we don't care if there's a better way to raise the money. You might be like, oh, well, a bake sale's a dumb idea. Who cares? We want to know if it will work. If there's a better way, it's kind of irrelevant. I'm dealing with the argument that having the bake sale with the money they saved will lead them to open their doors in 6 months. Okay. So what would it mean to be wrong? They don't open their door in 6 months. Okay, well, how could that happen? How could it happen that they don't open their door in 6 months, even though they save some money and they're going to have a bake sale for the money they don't have? How could that possibly be true? Okay. What if they don't make enough money in the bake sale? What if there are some legal issues that keep them from opening their doors? What if some unexpected expenses arise? Okay. What if a meteor hits the Earth and ruins all life, right? Like that would destroy this plan. Corona close it. What if there's a pandemic? And yeah, that there was a pizza restaurant down the street from my apartment that opened in like May, like peak pandemic time. I always felt just really bad for them, but I've gone a few times since we've been able to and tried to support their fledgling business that opened in such a bad time in New York City. Yeah, okay, so these are all things that could ruin the argument if they were true. And so then we think about, okay, well, what must be true to save the argument? And it's just going to be the mirror image of these, right? The assumptions have to be the bake sale makes enough money. There aren't legal issues that prevent them from opening. There's no meteor. No meteor blows up the Earth. Or pandemic ruins these plans. And no unexpected expenses or other, it doesn't have to even be unexpected, but no unexpected or other expenses cut into their caches, their cash amount too much. Okay. In some ways, there's kind of an implicit math equation being built here. The savings plus the bake sale minus any spending needs to be greater than or equal to the opening costs. A lot of critical reasoning arguments actually do have kind of a math component to them, even though you don't have to do calculations. The reasoning is still there. And this argument, and here's kind of the important thing, notice that the savings are just kind of there. They're really not that important to the reasoning of this argument. What we're really curious about are these things. Okay, will the bake sale make enough money And will they spend money on other stuff? And then there is the bigger question of, will the world destroy itself in some horrible way, keeping them from opening? But for the math of their finances, this is the situation we're dealing with. And the fixed amount is really not that important to the reasoning. We know that fixed amount is not enough because they're having a bake sale to raise the rest. Okay. And so that's really where the assumptions lie that we're going to want to deal with. Okay. And that's the key to critical reasoning. So the answer to this first question is B. If they've paid off their student loans, it makes me feel better about the idea that they won't have to spend money on other stuff. This is a strengthened question based on that word supports. Supports usually indicate strengthened questions. Okay. And this strengthens that argument. How do you strengthen an argument? You make one of the assumptions more likely. Okay. So they don't have student loans, or they know a celebrity baker. Great. Your bake sale idea, which kind of sounded stupid at first, it's still pretty stupid, but it's less stupid. If you know a celebrity baker, I have more reason to think your bake sale will be a success. Parth, you asked about the negation technique. The negation technique is a useful question for find the assumption questions, because the negation technique, if an assumption is false, the argument falls apart, right? These are the assumptions. There are usually many that a question can, or that an argument can deal with. If the bake sale is not successful, the argument fails. If they lose money elsewhere, the argument fails. If a meteor shower destroys everything, the argument fails. So these have to be true for the argument to hold. And if I'm going to strengthen an argument, I make one of them a little more supported, a little more likely. JDB is not supporting the idea that the bake sale is successful. Oh, this one here is supporting that the bake sale is successful, that they know a celebrity baker. This is supporting the pillar that they don't spend money on other stuff. That is more supporting this argument. They don't lose money on other things. It gives some support to that pillar, that assumption pillar. Because if they lose too much money to other stuff, this argument blows up. So by saying they've paid off their student loans, okay, at least they're not going to lose that money. At least they don't have a big debt in student loans to pay. It doesn't guarantee the argument. That's the key, right? Strengtheners don't guarantee arguments. They make an argument more likely. They make the reasoning a little more likely. Okay. Someone asked, isn't A strengthening the premise that they saved enough? I never actually cared that they saved enough. The amount that they saved is actually not material to the reasoning that this argument is using. Whatever they saved, it's not enough. I know that. What are they going to do to make the rest? They're going to have a bake sale. And so the assumption is that bake sale is going to be successful enough to close the gap. I like this trap because it's in the real world, right? And this is why I said we're worried about the reasoning, not the reality, right? In reality, yeah, I feel better about their computer store. For the reasoning of this argument, this doesn't matter. This just gives me an amount for the money saved. This explains a premise. It gives context to the premise that they have money saved. When you strengthen an argument, you want to strengthen an assumption the argument is making. Okay. For the reasoning, this is what's so important. I'm not really interested in the reality of whether or not they're going to open their store. I want to know if the reasoning they are using can be strengthened. Will the bake sale really get them to where they need to be? And will they not blow their money on other stuff? It's also worth noting that we don't know if they've saved this money. We don't really know this money went into their savings. They could have blown this money already. Who knows? But even if it did go to their savings, they still don't have enough. They're still going to have a bake sale to raise the rest. Is the bake sale going to work or not? That's the question. Okay, so this is what the assumption family is. We find those gaps. We find those things that need to be true to support an argument by asking those three questions. What would it mean for this argument to fall apart? How could that happen if the premises are true? And what assumptions save it from happening? And if we strengthen an argument, we make those assumptions more likely. And if we weaken an argument, we make the assumption less likely. So if Steve has a habit of going on very expensive benders in Las Vegas, I feel a little bit worried about that savings that they have. I'm worried about if they're going to save the profits from the bake sale, Steve might blow it. Okay. But it all hinges on those three questions. So JD's asking a question, what is the difference between necessary assumptions and sufficient assumptions? There's no such thing as a sufficient assumption. Uh, all assumptions are necessary. What that means is that if the assumption is not true, the conclusion falls apart. The conclusion will not be true. A sufficient piece of information would guarantee that the conclusion is correct. A necessary assumption doesn't guarantee the conclusion is correct, but is required for the conclusion to be correct. The GMAT does not deal much with sufficiency in critical reasoning. Data sufficiency in quant's a different kind of thing, but for critical reasoning, it's rare that you actually have to find sufficient information. I have seen one question that did, but it's very unusual. So let's try this. Let's try this here. So this is another reason I mentioned you can do. Here's a more real life example. I know we're probably all just so sick of politics, but I just love this. I love this game. Take a look at this paragraph detailing a fairly popular argument made by certain people. I'm not going to take a side. I don't care. That's not the point of the exercise. You might agree with this. You might disagree with this. You might think it's a great idea or a terrible idea. Not important. The point is, let's do the three questions. Let's work these three questions on this argument here. The answer to the last question was B. Yes. Take about 20 more seconds to think about this. All right, so what would it mean? And again, I do recommend reading up on critical reasoning and getting used to picking apart arguments and finding premise conclusion, specifying what those are. It's a very good skill to develop. For today, we're talking about the 3 questions to do after you've done that. The reasoning part, after you've understood the argument, now you do your critical reasoning on it. Now you be critical of the argument. What would it mean for this conclusion to be false? It would mean that changing to a direct popular vote does not increase the odds that they win the presidency. Okay, they meaning they, the Democrats, because this is their argument. Okay, how could this happen? How could it not increase the odds that they win the presidency when they have won the popular vote but lose the election because of the electoral college? Yeah, somehow, what if they lose the popular vote? Right, they stop getting the popular vote. Okay, well, how might that happen? Well, there are a few ways that could happen. It might be that the country just changes opinions, right? The majority shifts. Okay, yeah, they had a very popular candidate, something like that. The Republicans had a popular candidate that year. But and that's true, right? Either the opinions of the country shift, or a very popular Republican or a very unpopular Democrat runs, something like that. Uh, a bunch of Democrats stop voting. That would do it. I like that one. Right? Many Democrats decide not to vote for some reason. That would do it. Get out and vote, always important. I also like the people's preference change. Okay. Someone says a miscount of votes. I don't think that would be, for the purposes of the GMAT especially, I don't think we're interested in that kind of ruining the argument. I guess it is theoretically possible, but it's more interesting if that's not the situation. The argument I heard recently that made me kind of like this, wanted to use this exercise, was what if a bunch of Republicans currently don't vote because of the electoral college system? I had never thought about this before, but someone mentioned to me, and I was like, that's an interesting point. Now, it could also be true that a bunch of Democrats don't vote for the electoral college system, but someone mentioned, like, hey, in a bunch of states, there's no, a lot of voters just think there's no reason for me to vote. My state's gonna vote Democrat, or my state's gonna vote Republican. And they might just say, like, there's no reason to vote in my state. But if by switching to a popular vote, and this is also an argument some people make for, like, yeah, that's why we should switch to this system, so that people who feel like they have no reason to vote should vote. That's getting into the politics of it, but just like, it was an interesting thought to realize, oh, what if there's a bunch of people not voting simply because they think there's no reason to? And by switching the way the votes are tallied and the way the winners decided, it shifts who votes enough that, yeah, currently Democrats win the popular vote in this system, but maybe there's a swath of Republicans who just don't vote that often. Conversely, it's also very possible that actually there's a bunch of Democrats who don't vote that often, and it'll go in their favor as well. But that is something you would have to consider to determine the veracity of this argument. So, in order for this argument to be true, you would have to assume that the country's opinions don't shift, the majority at least, or the plurality, doesn't have to technically be the majority, don't shift. You have to assume that Democrats don't stop voting. You have to assume that there aren't a load of non-voting Republicans who would vote if the system switches. All those have to be true for this argument to be true. Okay. Just thought it was an interesting example of things that you might not think about when this argument's first presented. So now let's do this with actual GMAT questions. Let's see how this actually works on the test. Oh, before we do that, actually, I want to make one quick point about the types of arguments that you find on the test, because there are two major structures of arguments. I call them prediction plans and hypothesized causes. And it helps to know which world you're in. A prediction plan is when you are either doing something intentionally in order to cause some effect in the future, or something is happening, and so it makes you think something's going to happen in the future. So the example I usually use is, it is raining outside, so conclusion, the sidewalk will be wet. Or the sidewalk is probably wet. Whereas a hypothesized cause might flip that. A hypothesized cause, the premise might be, the sidewalk is wet. Conclusion, it is probably raining. And notice the different kinds of assumptions we make in order to let these arguments stand. We want to assume there's not a canopy over the sidewalk, because if there is, the sidewalk's not getting wet even though it's raining. Okay. I don't know how else the sidewalk would not get wet in rain, but something, we're assuming something's not keeping the sidewalk dry. Okay. In a hypothesized cause, we want to say something else is not getting the sidewalk wet, e.g. a broken fire hydrant or something, a sprinkler system. It can't be that, or the argument falls apart. If that's what's getting the sidewalk wet, it's not the rain. So the conclusion is wrong. And so this, knowing which kind you're in, you ask basically, how could the plan or prediction fail? And here, what else could cause the phenomenon? Phenomenon. I think that's how you spell it. Okay. And that will help in the three questions you ask. How could this conclusion be false? It helps know what kind of conclusion it is. Okay. Parth asks how to identify which type you're in. Good question. The real thing I would say, thank you for asking because I meant to specify. The real thing I would note is that over in a prediction plan, the cause is in the premise and the effect is in the conclusion. And in a hypothesized cause, the effect is the premise and the cause is the conclusion. So if you're guessing a cause for a certain effect, you're in a hypothesized cause. If your premise is the cause and you think it will mean some effect, you're in a prediction plan. And that's not to say there's not sometimes some blurry overlap between these two. That does happen. Okay. Both in the CR games, I presume both can be put into prediction plan or hypothesized cause problems. I don't quite know what that question means, JD. On that, there's another video I've done on critical reasoning called Critical Reasoning Games, where I talk a little bit about something very similar to this. And I would actually say, JD, that the way I teach critical reasoning has shifted a little bit since I made that video. And I think it's like games 1 and 2, A means B and A was caused by B, something like that. Those two are what I've shifted into these labels now: prediction plan arguments or hypothesized cause arguments. Just it's different titles for the same idea. Okay, so in a prediction plan, the cause is the premise. It is raining. That's a cause. Conclusion, the sidewalk will be wet. That's an effect. In a hypothesized cause premise, the sidewalk is wet. That's an effect. Conclusion, it must be raining, because that's a cause. Okay. So in a prediction plan, the cause is in the premise. In a hypothesized cause, the cause is the conclusion. I'll clear this up more at the end of the class if anyone still has questions. This is not a huge thing for tonight. It's just I find it helpful to categorize what type of argument you're in. Okay, let's practice the, both questions we've seen today have been prediction plans. And so the thing we want to wonder is, well, how could this prediction or plan go awry? Like, how could Democrats change the vote to a popular vote system and actually find that they're not more likely to win elections? Or how could Bill and Steve have this bake sale and have it not let them open their doors in 6 months? And yeah, so in both situations, Parth, good question. In both situations, what we're wondering is how can the premise be true and the conclusion be false? You don't want to wonder if the premise is false. The premise is always true. But how can the conclusion be false with those premises? So let's see this. Let's do this. Just take a minute and a half, 2 minutes here, and answer the 3 questions for this. This is an official GMAT argument, or official GMAT question now. Okay. What would it mean for the conclusion to be false? How could that happen? Given the premises are true, what assumptions must be true to save the argument? It's about a minute. Okay, it's about 2 minutes here. So let's go through this here. Premise, conclusion. Premise, it's helpful to start with the conclusion, I'd say, actually. Try to pinpoint the thing the author really wants you to believe. The average salary for all workers in Cravonia will increase in the next 4 years. What's the premise? Why do we think that the salary will increase? Well, because the salary of college degrees is greater than salary no college degrees. Okay, we know that that's been true for a long time. And we know that um, the enrollments in college enrollments, show more college degrees in workforce for 4 years. Okay, so what would it mean for this conclusion to be false? Well, it would mean that the average salary does not increase. Okay. How could that be true? So Sato, you say that college, that current enrollments means like maybe they'll drop out, right? We're told that current enrollments are high. And I think that's a pretty good point. But notice it also says that over the next 4 years, the percentage of the workforce with degrees will increase dramatically. So it kind of the premise kind of implies they're not all going to drop out. Enough people are going to stick around such that the percentage of the workforce with the college degree does increase. If they do drop out and that doesn't happen, you're right, that would ruin the argument. But on the GMAT, you want to be as generous with the premises as possible. Give as much of the premise as you can and see what happens. So yeah, and if you want to start by questioning the premise, because that just helps you get grounded, because that's something we do in real life all the time. That's an important aspect of real life critical reasoning. So if you want to start there, that's fine. Be like, well, maybe people are going to drop out. Okay, but hold up. Let's just say they don't. I'll give you that they won't. They won't drop out. Maybe the salary will still not increase. How could that happen if indeed there are more or a higher percentage of college grads in the workforce? So similar thing, like what if they move to another country? Again, the premise kind of says that in the Crevonian workforce, there will be a higher percentage of college grads. I would agree that if it just said current enrollments are high, we might wonder, okay, enrollments are high. Will the workforce actually be inundated with college graduates? But the premise kind of gives us that. And I don't, rule of GMAT critical reasoning, don't mess with premises. Okay. Dominic says he's finding it hard to come up with assumptions that aren't related to that aren't related to supply and demand. That's okay. I think that's a very pertinent thing to think about here. So how could the average salary not increase? And if it's a supply and demand thing, that's fine. Okay. Yeah, JD has a good thought. Hold up. What if the salary of non-grads drops, cancels out the salary of grads? Okay. That would ruin this argument. Even though it's true that there's a higher percentage of people in the workforce with college degrees, if the non-graduate salary plummets, argument dead. Parth, you say that they don't take up jobs, they go for entrepreneurship. I guess that counts, because I guess that counts as being in the workforce. So Parth, you're saying basically like maybe they're in the workforce, but they take jobs, they are self-employed in their own jobs. And so they're making peanuts because they're entrepreneurs. I think that is an interesting thought, right? Maybe a bunch of college grads take low-paying jobs, or in your specific case, entrepreneurships. What if there's more college grads, supply is up, so price drops? This is a supply and demand thing, meaning their salary, the price of the college grads means their salary drops. Okay. Yeah, salary of college degrees has historically been higher, but maybe with this influx of new people, the past trend isn't the present trend. Yeah, what if there's a recession? What if there's a recession? That would, of course, nuke this argument. It would not last. So we must assume that the salary of non-grads does not, and it would probably need to be steeply drop. Steeply is GMAT code. Like if it just says does not drop, that's probably not strong enough because the salary could drop a little bit and the argument still hold. But when they use words like steeply or significantly, that's code for enough to ruin the argument, basically. Sometimes it's enough to just have a binary change, like less. If it's any less, argument's done, even if it's $1 less. But for this, they would probably need to clarify steeply drop. We need the college grads to take high salaried positions so that they don't take entrepreneurships. We need the college grad salary to not decrease. And we need there to not be a recession. Okay. All of these are assumptions that have to be true. And when we look at the answer choices, take 30 seconds or so to work through these and see if you can find a match. C is correct. The higher average salary is not due to scarcity of workers with a college degree. If that's true, if it's about scarcity and there's an influx of college graduates, businesses can start offering lower salaries for college graduates, and that will actually decrease the average salary of the Crevonian workforce. Okay. That is the answer here. We can come back to this one for questions at the end, but I want to do a few more before we wrap up for the evening. So this was another, by the way, this was a prediction plan. We're just wondering, how does this plan go awry? Let's take a minute and a half or so to work on this problem here and answer the 3 questions about this argument. So someone has mentioned in the chat that this is an hypothesized cause argument, and that is correct. Okay. The conclusion here is that, hey, smoking likely causes depression in teenagers. Okay. Why? Well, we have this group of non-smokers, of never smokers. Then, 1 year later, those who started smoking were 4 times likely to be depressed. And then it also does say, it says nicotine changes brain chemistry. If you want to add that, that's fine. So we know that these are non-smokers, but after a year, those who started smoking are 4 times as likely to be depressed as those who are not. And nicotine does affect brain chemistry. So conclusion, smoking probably causes the depression in these teenagers. This is a guessed cause. Here's the effect. Hey, high incidence of depression. Here's the guessed cause. Smoking likely causes depression in teenagers. And it's going to be our job in a hypothesized cause argument to wonder, is there another cause? Is there another reason for this? Is the causation maybe reversed? That's a pretty common game. I saw some people talk about that. That is a good thought here. Okay, so what would it mean for this conclusion to be false? That smoking does not cause depression in teenagers. Yeah, Sato's got it. Hold up. What if, so how could that happen? Well, if depressed teenagers were more likely to start smoking. Okay. Parth says other factors cause depression. Well, yeah, they also probably need to cause something else, Parth. It's probably likely that you would need something that causes both, to really dig into the reasoning here, something causes both depression and smoking. I don't know what that would be necessarily. You know, could be some difficulty in school popularity, right? Those who were depressed and started smoking felt bullied at school. I don't know. So maybe it's the bullying that causes them to smoke and feel depressed, or maybe a family tragedy causes depression and smoking at the same time. No, so JDS is it maybe smokers have a different standard for happiness? I don't think so. I think this is because seems to be like clinical depression. It's not if they report that they're happy, they are diagnosed with depression. Okay. So what must be true? It must be true that depressed teenagers were not more likely to start smoking. And it must be true that there wasn't some other cause. There's not some third cause for both. And it's hard to, right, in critical reasoning, we don't usually try to predict the right answer. Sometimes it's very hard to do that, but we do want to get in the right ballpark. So take a look at the answers. Which of those strengthens the argument and bolsters one of those assumptions we found? Yeah. So a lot of people are choosing A, and Matt says A becomes easy after this setup work. Yeah, this is the beauty of doing this. And my last free GMAT prep hour was about this very thing. I called it the value of pre-work. I focused mostly on data sufficiency, but I did do a critical reasoning as well. And this kind of thing, when you reason well, the answer takes care of itself. That's why you can ask those 3 questions. You can ask them about any argument you come across. Day to day, day in, day out, you're going to see an argument. identify the premise conclusion, and ask those 3 questions. If you get good at those 3 questions, you get really good at critical reasoning. I guarantee it. It also it requires some imagination. That's what's kind of fun about it. You have to imagine the circumstances that are possible. That creativity is part of the kind of fun of this, if it is fun at all. Let's do 1 or 2 more. Let me see which one I want to do. Well, that one's a good one. That one's very relevant to today's. Oh, yeah. Let's do this one. It's just so pertinent. So take 3 minutes, or 2 minutes or so, and answer those 3 questions. All right, gang. This one is just right up our alley these days. So what would it mean for this conclusion to be false? Well, the conclusion is that um, there's not a public health benefit using for vaccinating children with this nasal spray. So it would be false if there is a public health benefit by widespread vaccination using this nasal spray. Okay, premise conclusion, no public health benefit to vaccinating kids with nasal spray. Why is that true? Well, children don't develop serious complications from influenza. So there's no, and like, yeah, I know parents have historically been scared of taking their kids to get the needle injection, but there's this new fancy kind that doesn't hurt as much, but kids don't really suffer that much anyway, so not a public health benefit. Well, okay, how could there be a health benefit even though children don't develop serious complications here? And I think a lot of people are seeing it. What if children spread influenza to adults? Just leave that as a statement. If children spread influenza to adults, it might be very helpful to get them a vaccine. Even though they themselves never suffer that much, it keeps an adult from suffering tremendously. I had someone said something like maybe maybe adults can take nasal spray as well. That's not really relevant to the reasoning of this argument because we are talking about the benefit of vaccinating kids with this nasal spray. Again, you worry about the reasoning of the argument, the specific argument at hand. Be very specific in conclusions because it tells you what you need to be thinking about. I want to wonder, hey, is there actually a benefit to vaccinating kids with this nasal spray? Not, hey, is this nasal spray beneficial? It's a subtle difference. But I don't care about vaccinating adults with this nasal spray. I care about vaccinating kids with this nasal spray and if it actually does have a public health benefit, even though kids really don't suffer that much when they get influenza. Okay. Well, in order for this argument to hold, I need to assume children don't really spread influenza to adults. There might be other assumptions, but that's certainly the big one here. So take a look at the answer choices and match. See some answer choice D in the chat. That is correct. That is an assumption that the argument depends on, because if adults do contract influenza from children who have influenza, then vaccinating kids is a great thing to do. There is a public health benefit to this. And so the answer is D. Okay, let's do one more, because I do want to talk about this kind of question and explain the discrepancy questions and talk about how we can use the three-step approach for questions like this. This here, when you see a fill in the blank, I find it very helpful to think about these almost always as weaken questions in disguise. Same thing with explain the discrepancy questions. If this were an explain the discrepancy question, the end of this paragraph would be, nevertheless, farmers doubled their profits per acre using this new machine. Either way, in either situation, the reason I think it's helpful to think about these as weakeners is that we're countering someone else's argument. In this case, this is actually a rare case where we're not countering the author's argument. We're countering someone else's argument. Someone thinks, hey, these farmers will not double their profits. We have this new machine. You can grow corn 15 inches apart instead of 30 inches apart. But lower yields per plant. You don't get as much corn per plant. So even though you have basically twice as many corn plants, corn stalks, because they're twice as close as they used to be, you won't double your profits because you don't get as many yields per plant. Okay. Turns out we want to say, well, hold up, maybe we did. Maybe farmers did double their profits. That's when we go into the three questions, right? What would it mean for this conclusion to be false? How could that happen? And what assumptions would save this argument? Okay, what would it mean for the conclusion to be false? The farmers do double their profits, which we're actually told they do. How could that happen? How can they double their profits even though they're growing, the corns, though they're closer together, don't actually double in yield? You get less per stalk. Okay. So how could they not double their yields? Or how could they double their profits even though they don't double their yields? Someone says it takes quicker to harvest, maybe. Maybe the price of corn increases. That's possible. Maybe the quality of the corn is better so they can raise the price. Yeah. Maybe the costs go down. That's a good one as well. It's got to be, price or cost. That's what's going on here. That's how you calculate profit. Okay. So what assumptions do we have to save the argument? That the price does not increase and that the costs of growing corn don't decrease enough to actually double their profits. Okay, so when we go to the answer, we are looking for why they actually doubled their profits. Okay, we want to weaken these assumptions, meaning we want to say, actually, maybe the price does increase, or actually their costs do decrease, because that would weaken the argument that they're not going to double their profits. And for the sake of time here, if you're watching this recording, go ahead and pause if you don't want to spoil the answer. But for us here, where is it? Yeah, A. We'll minimize the need for weed control and irrigation. And notice the lovely adjective costly, weed control and irrigation. We save money there. Okay. So that's just a primer for this. You have to practice it. So someone asks, why is D wrong? Because their plants grown for acre will almost double, but what's the caveat that the argument gave us? They produce lower yields per plant. Yeah, you double the stalks, but you don't actually double the yield. That's the whole question. Hey, if we don't double the yield, we probably won't double our profit. But then this argument actually says, no, we do double the profit. We want to weaken the idea that you don't double the profit. Well, we get rid of the weed control. So that's A. We already kind of know D. We already know we're basically going to double the amount of corn stalks grown, but it's not going to double the yield. Okay. Harris, I think you're asking about like why did I think about the argument that someone else was making, right? Why did I think about the argument that, hey, we're not going to double our yield or double profit because each plant makes less corn, even though there's 2 times as much corn, basically. The reason I like doing this is because if I say this is the conclusion, the thing my author clearly actually believes, there's really no premise to that conclusion. That's just my author's belief, and it's going against someone else's belief. And so to strengthen my author's position, I actually want to weaken someone else's position. And that position does have a premise. That position's premise is, yeah, there's 2 times as much corn stalk, but each plant makes less corn. So you're not going to double your, right? The inference here is you're not going to double your yield. And so therefore you're not going to double your profit. And it's my job to say like, maybe my costs decrease enough. It's a subtle distinction. It's not a huge deal. I just find it helpful to think about weakening that argument since it actually has a premise conclusion. Okay. JD, because the distance between corn stalks is half as much, right? It's like if I had a corn stalk here and here and here, and those were 30 inches apart. And then I can cut that distance in half and actually put one here and here and it here. It doesn't really work with big or with small numbers, but let's add one more. Like let's imagine the red is the original. There are 4 red rows of corn. Now I can add 3 orange rows of corn at the halfway points. Yeah, JD, but that doubles the amount of corn plants you can plant. We're going to save this for the post-recording class, everybody. Thank you all for attending. JD, stick around, we'll talk. If you are looking out for other free courses, other free materials, again, I mentioned some at the beginning. Check out our upcoming courses at manhattanprep.com/gmat/classes. Try our first session for free. Try our part of our online course for free. We do these every 2 weeks or so. Come to the next one. Hope to see you there. Have a wonderful 2 weeks, and I will see you soon.